This is not just another war breaking out somewhere far away. This is the moment a system you rely on every single day begins to show visible signs of strain. Right now, what is unfolding in the Middle East is no longer a contained military confrontation between regional actors. It is a real-time stress test of the global structure that has quietly shaped your cost of living, your energy prices, and the stability of the world economy for decades. And the most uncomfortable part is this: most people don't realize how close this is to them until the effects are already hitting their lives. For years, the assumption was simple: advanced technology, superior defense systems, and overwhelming financial power would guarantee control. That belief created a sense of invisible security, a feeling that no matter how intense conflicts became, the system itself would always hold. But what we are witnessing now is different, not because of a single strike or a single escalation, but because of sustained pressure applied in a way the system was never truly designed to handle over time. This is where the illusion begins to crack. Because modern power is not just about how strong you are at your peak, but how long you can sustain that strength under continuous strain. And when that strain builds, it doesn't stay contained within the battlefield. It spreads outward, quietly at first, then all at once into markets, into supply chains, into fuel prices, and into the everyday decisions people are forced to make. So the real question is no longer who wins or loses this conflict. The real question is whether the system behind it can absorb the pressure without forcing the rest of the world to pay the price. What makes this moment even more unsettling is that the battlefield itself is not behaving the way people expect. For years, advanced defense systems were presented as near impenetrable shields, capable of neutralizing threats with precision and speed. They were symbols of technological dominance, reinforcing the belief that modern warfare had become predictable and controllable. But reality is now exposing a deeper truth. No system is designed for unlimited pressure. These defenses were built on assumptions about the scale of attacks, the frequency of threats, and the economic cost of sustaining protection. When those assumptions are pushed beyond their limits, the entire structure begins to reveal its vulnerabilities, because every interception is not just a technical action, it is a financial one. Every response consumes resources, and when the pace of pressure accelerates beyond expectation, the question quietly shifts from, can it stop this, to how long can it keep stopping this? That shift changes everything. Because once sustainability becomes the issue, even the most advanced systems are forced into a defensive position they were never meant to hold indefinitely. And this is where a different kind of strategy begins to take shape, one that does not rely on speed, but on patience. For decades, military doctrine has emphasized quick victories and decisive outcomes, but what we are seeing now challenges that mindset. Instead of rushing toward a final blow, the focus shifts toward controlling the rhythm of the conflict itself. A prolonged engagement, carefully managed, begins to serve a purpose. It allows pressure to build gradually, forcing the opponent to respond continuously, draining not only physical resources, but also economic capacity and psychological resilience. This is not about overwhelming force in a single moment. It is about creating a situation where every response carries a cost, and those costs accumulate over time. In this kind of environment, endurance becomes more important than intensity. The side that can maintain its position longer, that can manage its resources more efficiently, begins to shape the outcome without needing a dramatic turning point. It is a quieter form of control, but often a more decisive one. The consequences of this shift do not stay confined to the battlefield. There is always a moment in a conflict when its impact begins to spill outward into the global system. And that moment is often tied to energy. The Middle East is not just a region of geopolitical tension. It is one of the most critical arteries of global energy flow. At the center of that system lies the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply moves every single day. When stability in that corridor is questioned, the reaction is immediate. Markets respond, shipping becomes more expensive, insurance costs rise, and within a short period of time, those pressures begin to translate into something far more tangible: higher fuel prices, increased transportation costs, and a renewed strain on everyday living expenses. This is the point where regional conflict becomes a global concern, not because of direct involvement, but because the systems that connect economies are now under stress. And once that stress begins to spread, it becomes much harder to contain than the conflict that triggered it. As the pressure moves deeper into the economic layer, attention inevitably turns to the foundation that has supported global trade for decades: the dominance of the U.S. dollar in energy transactions. This system, often referred to as the petrodollar, has not just been a financial arrangement, but a pillar of geopolitical influence. However, what we are witnessing now is not a sudden collapse of that system, but something more subtle and potentially more significant: sustained pressure. When uncertainty rises in critical energy corridors, countries begin to explore alternatives, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. Payment mechanisms diversify, partnerships expand, and flexibility replaces dependence. This does not erase the dollar's role overnight, but it introduces a shift in behavior that gradually reshapes the landscape, because once multiple options begin to coexist, the balance of influence becomes less concentrated, and in times of instability, even small shifts in how energy is traded can carry disproportionate consequences for the broader financial system. At the same time, while some nations are directly engaged in the tension, others are positioned to benefit without firing a single shot. This is one of the most consistent patterns in geopolitical history. When one power is absorbed in conflict, another expands its influence through quieter means. Russia stands to gain from elevated energy prices, strengthening its revenue streams and reinforcing its role as a key supplier. Meanwhile, China approaches the situation with calculated patience, focusing on economic partnerships, infrastructure, and alternative financial channels. It does not need to dominate the battlefield to shape the outcome. Instead, it leverages stability, trade, and long-term positioning to increase its relevance in a world that is becoming more uncertain. This dynamic does not represent opportunism as much as it reflects strategic timing. In a system under pressure, those who can offer continuity and adaptability naturally become more influential, even without direct confrontation. But beneath all of these structural shifts, military, economic, and strategic, there is a dimension that cannot be ignored. War is often analyzed through the lens of power and systems, but its consequences are ultimately human. Behind every shift in energy prices, there are households adjusting their spending. Behind every supply chain disruption, there are workers facing uncertainty, and within the region itself, there are civilians living through the direct reality of instability, where daily life is shaped by factors far beyond their control. The language of geopolitics can sometimes make these realities feel distant or abstract, but they are not. They are immediate, personal, and deeply consequential. Understanding this human dimension does not weaken the analysis, it strengthens it. Because it reminds us that beyond every system under pressure, there are people bearing the weight of its consequences, often without the ability to influence the outcome. What makes the situation even more dangerous is that it is no longer easy for any side to step back. Once a conflict reaches this level of entrenchment, every option begins to carry a cost. Escalation risks widening the crisis, but de-escalation can signal weakness or loss of leverage. This creates a tension loop where each decision is constrained by the consequences of the previous one. Time, in this context, is not neutral. It amplifies pressure. The longer the situation continues, the more resources are consumed, the more uncertainty spreads, and the more difficult it becomes to find a clean exit. This is how conflicts transform from short-term confrontations into prolonged structural stress points within the global system. And once that transformation occurs, resolution is no longer just about negotiation, it is about managing accumulated consequences that extend far beyond the original trigger. For many people watching from a distance, it is tempting to see this as a geopolitical story that unfolds far away from their daily lives. But the reality is much closer than it appears. The effects of this kind of instability do not remain contained within borders. They show up in fuel prices, in the cost of transporting goods, in the decisions businesses make about hiring and investment, and in the policies governments implement to manage economic pressure. Even if someone never follows international politics, they will still feel its impact through the small but consistent changes in their everyday expenses. This is how global systems operate quietly, interconnected, until stress in one area begins to ripple outward. And when those ripples reach a certain point, they become impossible to ignore. Looking ahead, what we are likely witnessing is not a sudden collapse of the existing global order, but a period of adjustment. Power is not disappearing, it is redistributing. Influence is becoming more contested, more flexible, and less concentrated in a single center. This does not necessarily mean the world is becoming more unstable, but it does mean that the assumptions people have relied on for decades are being tested in real time. Systems that once appeared fixed are now adapting under pressure, and new patterns are beginning to emerge. The outcome is not predetermined, but the direction is clear. A more complex, more interconnected, and more competitive global landscape where resilience matters more than dominance. What this moment ultimately demands is a shift in mindset. For a long time, stability was treated as the default setting of the modern world. Systems were expected to function, supply chains were assumed to flow, and global structures were believed to absorb shocks without fundamentally changing. But what we are seeing now challenges that assumption in a very real way. It does not mean the system is collapsing, but it does mean it is being tested in ways that expose its limits. And when limits are exposed, awareness becomes more important than certainty. Understanding how these pressures build, how they move from one layer to another, and how they eventually reach everyday life is no longer something reserved for experts. It becomes essential for anyone trying to navigate an increasingly interconnected world, because the difference between being surprised by change and being prepared for it often comes down to whether you are paying attention before the impact becomes unavoidable. This is not just a story about a conflict in one region. It is a story about how pressure moves through systems starting from the battlefield, spreading into energy markets, reshaping financial structures, and ultimately reaching the daily lives of millions of people. We have seen how assumptions about technological dominance are being challenged, how prolonged pressure can shift the balance of power, and how global stability is more interconnected than it appears. If there is one takeaway, it is this: what happens in one part of the world can quickly become part of your reality, whether through prices, policies, or long-term economic shifts. So if this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture more clearly, take a moment to follow the channel, save this video, and stay connected for deeper, more grounded insights on what's coming next. Because understanding these changes is not about fear, it is about being informed, staying prepared, and recognizing that even in times of uncertainty, awareness gives you an advantage moving forward.